The bathroom mirror was fogged up, but Emma could still see the outline of her face through the steam. She pressed her palms against the cold porcelain sink, leaning forward until her forehead nearly touched the glass. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Another notification. Another reminder that everyone else's life was moving forward while hers stood completely still. She picked up the phone with trembling fingers, a wedding announcement. Her college roommate glowing in a white dress, surrounded by people who looked genuinely happy to be there. Emma's thumb hovered over the like button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. Instead, she scrolled further. A promotion post, a vacation album, a new car, a new baby, a new everything. And then there was her, standing in a bathroom at 2 in the morning, feeling like she was drowning in a life that was supposed to be hers but felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. The tears came before she could stop them. Hot, angry tears that blurred her vision and made her chest heave with sobs she'd been holding back for months, maybe years. She slid down to the bathroom floor, her back against the tub, and let herself break in the only place she felt safe enough to fall apart. Emma had always been the quiet one, the girl in the back of the classroom who knew all the answers but never raised her hand, the friend who listened to everyone's problems but never shared her own, the daughter who smiled through family dinners even when she felt invisible at her own table. She'd learned early that taking up space was dangerous, that asking for attention was selfish, that her feelings, her dreams, her voice didn't matter as much as everyone else's. Her childhood wasn't tragic. There was no dramatic event she could point to and say, that's when it started. It was subtler than that, 1,000 small moments that taught her she wasn't enough. The time she excitedly showed her parents a drawing and they barely looked up from their conversation. The birthday party where she sat alone while the other kids played and no one noticed. The school presentation where she finally spoke up, only to be talked over and forgot. Each moment was small, forgettable to everyone else, but to Emma, they accumulated like stones in her pocket, weighing her down until she could barely move. By the time she reached her 20s, the pattern was set. She avoided social gatherings, making excuses that sounded reasonable but were really just fear dressed up in polite clothing. She watched opportunities pass her by because applying meant risking rejection, and rejection meant confirming what she already suspected about herself. She dated people who treated her like an afterthought because at least being an afterthought meant she was thought of at all. The worst part was how invisible it all was. From the outside, Emma looked fine. She had a job, she had an apartment, she had friends who would describe her as sweet if anyone asked, but inside she was disappearing. Every day, a little more of her faded away until she wasn't sure there was anything left to salvage. Work became a special kind of torture. She'd sit in meetings, ideas burning in her throat, but she'd swallow them down and watch someone else say essentially the same thing 5 minutes later to applause and approval. She'd stay late finishing projects, making them perfect, only to have her boss barely glance at them before moving on. She told herself she didn't need recognition, that doing good work was enough, but the lie was getting harder to maintain. Her apartment reflected the chaos inside her. Dishes piled in the sink, laundry overflowed from the hamper, mail sat unopened on the counter for weeks. She'd come home from work exhausted, not from the work itself but from the constant effort of pretending to be okay. She'd collapse on the couch, scroll through her phone for hours, watching other people live the lives she was too afraid to reach for, and then she'd fall asleep there because even moving to her bed felt like too much. The comparisons were relentless. Every scroll through social media was a fresh wound. She'd see former classmates buying houses while she struggled to pay rent. She'd see acquaintances traveling to exotic locations while she couldn't remember the last time she'd left her city. She'd see people in love, people getting promoted, people achieving dreams, and she'd feel the gap between their lives and hers growing wider every single day. She started declining invitations, first the big events, then the small ones, until eventually people stopped inviting her altogether. She told herself she preferred being alone, that she was an introvert, that she needed space to recharge. But the truth was darker than that. She avoided people because being around them reminded her of everything she wasn't. Every conversation felt like a performance she was failing. Every group interaction left her exhausted and convinced that everyone could see through her, could see how fundamentally broken she was. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Emma had been working on a proposal for 3 weeks. She'd poured everything into it, staying up late, sacrificing her weekends, crafting something she genuinely believed in. It was bold. It was innovative. It was the kind of work she'd always been capable of but too afraid to show. She submitted it with a mixture of pride and terror, and then she waited. The meeting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Emma arrived 15 minutes early, her stomach twisted in knots. She'd rehearsed what she'd say, how she'd present her ideas, how she'd finally prove that she had value. Her boss walked in, barely making eye contact, and slid a folder across the table. Inside was her proposal, marked with red ink and dismissive comments. Not quite what we're looking for. Needs more development. Perhaps next time. But it wasn't the rejection that destroyed her. She prepared herself for that possibility. It was what came next. Her boss then presented a nearly identical proposal from Marcus, the new hire who'd been there for 6 months. He praised its innovation, its boldness, its potential. The room erupted in congratulations. Marcus beamed, and Emma sat there, invisible once again, watching someone else get credit for ideas that looked suspiciously like the ones she'd been sharing in team meetings for weeks. She made it through the rest of the workday on autopilot. She smiled when appropriate, she nodded in meetings, she responded to emails, but inside something fundamental had shattered. She left the office at 5:30, walked to her car, sat in the driver's seat and screamed. A raw, primal scream that came from somewhere deep and wounded, a place she'd been protecting and ignoring for far too long. That night she didn't just cry, she unraveled completely. She looked at her life and saw nothing but wasted years and missed chances and a version of herself she barely recognized. She thought about all the times she'd stayed quiet when she should have spoken. All the times she'd made herself smaller to make others comfortable. All the times she'd sacrificed her own needs because she didn't believe they mattered. She sat on her bedroom floor, surrounded by tissues and the wreckage of her composure, and for the first time in her life she got angry, not at her boss or Marcus or anyone else, at herself, for accepting so little, for believing she deserved so little, for becoming complicit in her own disappearance. In that moment of rage and desperation, she grabbed a notebook from her desk. She didn't have a plan, she just needed to do something, anything, to stop the spiral. She opened to a blank page and without thinking she wrote, "Dear Emma." But not present-day Emma, the Emma who was 8 years old sitting alone at that birthday party, the Emma who was 12 being talked over in class, the Emma who was 16 believing she wasn't pretty enough or smart enough or enough of anything, the Emma who had spent her entire life learning to hate herself. Her hand moved across the page and words poured out, words she'd never said out loud, words she'd never let herself think. "I'm sorry," she wrote. "I'm sorry I left you behind. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry I listened when they said you didn't matter." She wrote about the birthday party, but this time she told 8-year-old Emma that those kids were missing out, that her worth wasn't determined by who chose to play with her. She wrote about the classroom, telling 12-year-old Emma that her ideas were brilliant and important, even if no one acknowledged them. She wrote about every moment of pain and rejection, and she met each one with the compassion she'd been denying herself for decades. Something shifted as she wrote, the anger softened into something else. Grief, maybe, for all the years she'd wasted being her own worst enemy, but also something tender, something that felt almost like hope. She realized, sitting there with her notebook, that she spoke to everyone in her life with more kindness than she'd ever shown herself. She'd comfort a friend going through a breakup, but she'd tear herself apart for the smallest mistakes. She'd defend a coworker being treated unfairly, but she'd accept her own mistreatment as deserved. She'd encourage others to chase their dreams, but she'd convince herself that her dreams were foolish and out of reach. "You deserved better," she wrote to her younger self, "and you still do." The words felt revolutionary, terrifying, true. She kept writing, page after page, until her hand cramped and her eyes burned with exhaustion. She wrote until she'd said everything she'd needed to hear for her entire life. And when she finally stopped, when she closed the notebook and set down her pen, she felt different, lighter, like she'd been carrying something impossibly heavy and had finally set it down. The next morning, Emma woke up and the world looked the same. Her apartment was still messy. Her job was still frustrating. Her life hadn't magically transformed overnight, but something inside her had shifted. For the first time in years, she didn't immediately reach for her phone to scroll through other people's lives. Instead, she stayed in bed for a few extra minutes and she thought about what she'd written the night before. She started small. She made her bed. It was a simple thing, almost embarrassingly simple, but it felt like reclaiming space in her own life. She opened the curtains and let sunlight into her bedroom. She made coffee and actually sat down to drink it instead of gulping it on her way out the door. She looked at herself in the mirror, and instead of cataloging everything wrong with her reflection, she just looked, really looked, and she tried to see herself the way she'd seen 8-year-old Emma in that letter. With compassion, with kindness, with the benefit of the doubt. Work was still difficult. Marcus still got credit he didn't deserve. Her boss still overlooked her, but Emma started making different choices. When she had an idea in a meeting, she forced herself to speak up, even though her voice shook and her hands trembled. The first time she did it, everyone turned to stare, surprised to hear her contribute. Her idea was met with lukewarm reception, but she'd said it. She'd taken up space, and the world hadn't ended. She started walking after work. Not long distances at first, just around her neighborhood. But the movement helped. The fresh air cleared her head. She'd think about her day, about the choices she'd made, about the person she was becoming. She started noticing things. The way the light hit the trees at sunset, the sound of kids playing in a nearby park, the small, beautiful details of life she'd been too consumed by her own pain to see. She pulled out that notebook every few days, Sometimes she wrote to her younger self, sometimes she wrote to her present self, sometimes she just wrote about her day, processing her feelings instead of burying them. The practice became a lifeline, a way to check in with herself, a way to remember that her inner world mattered, that her experiences were valid, that she was worth the time and attention. She rejoined an old hobby, photography. She'd loved it in college but had abandoned it because it felt frivolous, because spending money on herself felt selfish, because dedicating time to something that didn't serve anyone else felt wrong. But she bought a used camera and started taking pictures again. Nothing professional, nothing Instagram-worthy, just images of things that caught her eye. A flower growing through a crack in the sidewalk, her coffee cup in the morning light. Her own reflection in a window, looking not perfect but present. The changes were gradual. Some days were harder than others. There were mornings she woke up feeling like she'd made no progress at all, like she was still that girl crying on the bathroom floor, but she kept showing up for herself. She kept writing in her notebook. She kept speaking up at work even when her voice shook. She kept taking those walks. She kept treating herself like someone worth caring for. She started saying no to overtime that wasn't compensated, to friends who only called when they needed something, to situations that made her feel small. Each no felt rebellious. Each no carved out a little more space for her to exist. Each no was an act of self-preservation she'd never allowed herself before. And she started saying yes to invitations she'd normally decline, to opportunities that scared her, to conversations that made her vulnerable. She had coffee with an old friend and actually shared what she'd been going through instead of pretending everything was fine. She applied for a position at a different company, one that aligned with her values. She went to a photography meetup and showed her work to strangers, her heart pounding but her voice steady. The world started responding differently. Not because the world had changed, but because Emma was showing up differently. She was taking up space. She was asserting her value. She was treating herself like someone who mattered, and slowly others began to notice. Her new boss at the company that hired her actually listened to her ideas. Her friends started reciprocating the care she'd always given them. She started attracting people who appreciated her, not people who tolerated her. 6 months after that bathroom floor breakdown, Emma looked at her life and barely recognized it. Not because everything was perfect. She still struggled. She still had days where the old voices of self-doubt crept back in, but she had tools now, she had practices, she had a relationship with herself that was built on compassion instead of criticism. She pulled out her notebook one evening and read through those first letters to her younger self. The words made her cry, but differently than before. These were tears of recognition, of gratitude, of grief for the years lost, but also celebration for the life she was finally building. Emma realized something profound as she sat there. She'd spent her entire life waiting for permission to love herself, waiting for external validation to prove she was worthy, waiting for someone else to see her value before she could see it herself. But that permission, that validation, that recognition, it had to come from within first. She had to be the one to say, "You matter, your voice matters, your dreams matter, you matter." The simplest act of writing a letter to her younger self had cracked open something she'd kept locked away for decades. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a cure-all, but it was a beginning. A first step toward treating herself with the same kindness she'd always extended to everyone else. She wasn't perfect now. She still had insecurities. She still compared herself to others sometimes. She still had moments of doubt. But she also had something she'd never had before, a fundamental belief that she deserved to take up space in the world, that her existence wasn't a burden, that her voice had value, that she was enough exactly as she was. Emma closed her notebook and looked out her window at the city lights. Somewhere out there were other people sitting on bathroom floors, breaking down, feeling invisible and unworthy. She wished she could tell them what she'd learned, that the smallest act of self-compassion could save your life, that speaking to yourself with kindness could change everything, that you didn't need permission from anyone else to start treating yourself like someone worth loving. She picked up her phone not to scroll through social media but to journal one more thought before bed. Today I chose myself, and tomorrow I'll choose myself again, and the day after that, because I finally understand that I'm worth choosing. The journey wasn't over, it would never be over. Self-love wasn't a destination but a practice, something she'd have to choose again and again every single day. But for the first time in her life, Emma believed she was worth the effort, and that belief changed absolutely everything. If you've made it this far, if Emma's story resonated with something inside you, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below and tell me about a moment when you chose yourself or a moment when you wish you had. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because we're all on this journey together, and sometimes knowing we're not alone makes all the difference. Thank you for being here, thank you for listening, and remember, you're worth the kindness you give everyone else. You always have been.